Okay, so I get to talk about soil preparation and soil testing today. And I know it never seems as fun to talk about soils or to hear about soils as the plants themselves. And while I basically agree with that, we need to keep in mind that the soil is the foundation of a great garden. And a soil is a very critical, important natural resource that we need to take care of, manage, and maintain. So today I'm going to talk that soil prep and soil testing. Doesn't want to advance. Oh, there we go. So like I said, soil preparation, but I am going to focus on soil structure. This is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I'd like to change the garden chat from what type of soil do you have, which is a common question we gardeners ask one another, to so how's your soil structure doing? And you'll understand that as I go along. I will talk about the soil preparation then, as well as structure, and then I will wrap up with soil testing. I was going to get into soil temperature, but David covered that and did a great job, so we might get out of here a little earlier, or we'll have more time for more questions. So soil preparation, as I said, it's all about building a good foundation, mainly for the roots themselves. And with vegetable gardening, we're starting with young transplants or seeds. So those tiny roots, we really want to have a good foundation, a good bed for them to grow in. And this picture in the upper right-hand corner shows those root hairs. Many roots develop these root hairs that also increase the surface area for that root to be able to take up water and to be able to take up nutrients. And so they're very fine, they're very tiny. This is enlarged underneath a microscope. So, think of a soil bed that's going to promote rooting of these very fine roots as well as root hairs. And then there's even this thing called mycorrhizae, which are beneficial fungi that some roots, I hate to use the word infect roots because they don't infect, they're beneficial, but they help the plant to take up even more nutrients and even more water. And those are roots that sometimes don't have root hairs. So enough of that. So roots need soil to provide them with anchorage, but also with these four main things. And we all know that roots get water and nutrients from the soil, but we sometimes don't think about the pore space the soil needs to provide and oxygen. And that's why I put those two first. Roots they don't grow in sand, they don't grow in clay, they grow in the pore spaces between the clay particles or sand particles and so on. So we want a soil that provides adequate pore space and pore size for those roots to grow in. And roots will not grow without oxygen. Okay, they need about an equal amount of oxygen as water. Oxygen is just as critical, and it's something we sometimes don't think about when gardening. And that's why overwatering is so harmful to plants. That's why a poorly drained soil is so harmful to plants, one of the many reasons. So roots need soil with good structure. So how's your soil structure doing? Soils with good structure have increased macro and mesopore space. Macropores are just the largest pores in a soil. Meso are kind of medium size. And then micropores would be the size we find in a heavy clay soil. Very tiny, very, very tiny. Soils with good structure are well drained with good water holding capacity. And I know that sounds somewhat contradictory, but we need soils, heavy clay soils, to poorly drain. So we want a soil where the water will infiltrate and percolate through, not as fast as sand, but faster than in a clay soil. So we can get that oxygen in there, okay? Or it doesn't stay saturated for too long, so there's not enough oxygen. But on the same token, we want it to have good water holding capacity, since oxygen and water are equally important. So as you know, a very sandy soil would not have good water holding capacity. But a soil with good structure will provide that. Soils with good structure have very increased soil organisms, microorganisms, the macroorganisms like earthworms and arthropods, all those billions, literally billions of organisms that are in that soil that we don't even understand. I don't understand how critical and important they are. So ideal soil composition. This is what would be ideal. Mineral those are the particles we refer to as sand, silt, and loam. And of course, the type of mineral it is depends on the parent rock that the soil was formed from to begin with. Critical is organic matter. We want that to be about 5%. So that's the solid portion of soil. Most soil tests that have come across my desk, I see organic matter in about the 1 to 2% range. So the goal is to get it up to 5%. And then the other 50% should be pore space. That would be an ideal composition. So, and it may not, at any one point, it may not be exactly this and stay there, because obviously right after heavy rain, there's going to be more water in the soil than air, and vice versa when it's really dry. But this would be the ideal composition to aim for. And that's why we say keep your soil uniformly moist, but not saturated. So you need a soil with good structure to get towards this ideal soil composition. So what is good structure? It's basically what we refer to as good aggregation. Okay, so the soil, that picture on the right, is a soil with good structure. So texture, we always ask people, so what kind of soil do you have? And we're usually asking them, is it sandy? Is it a heavy clay? That's texture, which is the particle size. And it is important. I'm not saying it's not important, it is. But aggregates are groups of those mineral particles bound together by what we call soil cements. So, and that can be fungal hyphae, earthworm secretions, glues that are produced from fungi and bacteria. The one I like, the one we hear the most about, is glomalin, but there's other types. So you need a healthy soil with good organic or good organisms, microorganisms, because they're so important to producing those soil cements that help that aggregation. So like I said, they're highly dependent on both organic matter, getting to that 5% level, and on that biological activity in the soil. So what harms soil structure? John talked about this, about no-till, and I will talk about it as well, but we know excessive tillage. Tillage in and of itself is harmful to soil structure, but especially excessive tillage. And, forgive me for saying this, I've been saying it for years, but we're in a pandemic of excessive tillage. And I've said that for years. It seems a little sensitive right now since we're in the middle of a pandemic. But we've got the gentleman on the right. He was getting ready, his wife was getting ready to plant. So he grabbed the rototiller and went out there and tilled one more time. And if you look at that soil, it might need a little raking to make a nice seed bed, but it did not need, I don't believe, an additional tillage with that rototiller. I see people that use their rototillers for weeding during the summer. They will make their rows wide enough, and then once, every couple of weeks or once a month, they'll rototill up and down those rows, and that's their method of weeding. And that's extremely harmful to soil structure, and they're doing more harm than good. It'd be much better to mulch or use no-till or something such as that to control weeds. Compaction harms soil structure. So that's, compression of those pore spaces into tinier pore spaces when we walk on soil, especially if it's wet, or we rototill it or work it in any way when it's wet. We're going to create compaction. Low organic matter, that 1%, 1.5% that I frequently see, that's harming soil structure. We want to incorporate organic matter and continually on a yearly or every other year basis because we need that organic matter. It's critical. Bare soil leads to soil erosion. You get those heavy rains that can create compaction. It warms up really fast, which is good sometimes, but really hot soils maybe are not as helpful to those soil microorganisms and so on. Buildup of salts in soil. Our fertilizers are salts, so fertilizing, sometimes irrigation water we use can increase salts. Manure, if you use manure a lot as an organic matter that you're incorporating, manures can be high in salts. So salts can naturally build up in soils over time. And soils with poor structure, I probably don't have to tell any of you this, you've maybe encountered them, but like a heavy clay soil, it's going to need either poor movement of air and water, either too much or too low. So of course, low water holding capacity, such as a sandy soil, they drain much too fast, they dry out too quickly. Clay soils, we have that reduced infiltration and percolation, can lead to standing water, anaerobic environments, which are not conducive to those soil microorganisms that are so important to our soil aggregation and soil structure. So lower microbial populations, we can have slower or quicker temperature fluctuations on our soils with poor structure, which sometimes can be helpful, but frequently can be harmful, or at least an impediment to vegetable gardening. So what we aim for is a soil that looks like something on the left and not something on the right. And I'm not making any promises, but you're more likely to be able to grow carrots that look like this, or other vegetables. These are carrots grown by one of my master gardeners here in Platte County, and I know he has always paid very close attention to his soil and managing it and continuing to keep it in good condition. So again, no promises. There's other factors involved in growing carrots like that, but a soil with good structure, sandy loam with good structure, good aggregation, you're going to be more likely to be able to grow such carrots if you want them. So soil, there's enough on soil structure. So I want everybody, next time you see your neighbors or a gardener, or just, so how's your soil structure doing? And help spread the word. So soil preparation. The traditional is what we are starting to refer to as physical disturbance. So you go in and we remove all that plant cover. Maybe we're installing a new garden in a lawn. We remove all that sod and then we till it, okay? There are short-term benefits to this method, but there can be long-term consequences, particularly to that soil structure. It is the traditional method. The pros to doing the traditional method is it initially reduces compaction. If an area that's been a lawn, lawns tend to be compacted because they're watered a lot, they're walked on, they're mowed, they're played on. So it can initially reduce that compaction. And soils warm faster if they don't have any cover, so they can warm up faster in the spring, and we can maybe plant a little earlier. The organic matter incorporation, there's a more immediate benefit because you're incorporating that organic matter in right away to that 6 to 8 inch depth. But there's still benefit to just putting it on the surface and letting it eventually work its way into the soil. But you do get a more immediate benefit. Maybe you do some perennial weed control if you're doing that physical disturbance. The cons, notice there's more, but it does damage that soil structure, particularly rototilling. It kind of depends on the tillage that you use. There are tillage methods, such as a broad fork that I'll talk about later, that are less damaging than a rototiller, which tends to grind up that soil and break it into smaller pieces. So tilling wet soils can create compaction. It stirs up, brings up those weed seeds and exposes them. Organic matter breaks down faster in tilled soils than in soils that we do no-till on. Macroorganisms such as earthworms and whatnot can be harmed. Hard pans can be created. If you use a rototiller on a fairly regular basis, or even once a year, but the more you use it, the more likely it is to happen. And you rototill at the same depth all the time, and especially if you use these on high speeds, you're going to create that hard pan down below, which is going to impede infiltration or percolation of water, movement of water through that soil. So the other method that we're promoting is no-till. Okay, so that's where the soil and the existing plants are not disturbed, except where we plant the seed and the transplants themselves. The pros is soil structure, that organic matter and microorganisms are conserved. It prevents soil erosion because it has cover and roots to hold that soil in place. And we're not bringing up and exposing those weed seeds as much. The cons, on a brand new site, such as putting a garden into where a lawn was, the compaction will not initially be reduced, but you can use, if you correct no-till methods, and over time that compaction will be relieved. Increasing organic matter percentage will take longer because we're using a more natural process, but it can be done. And perennial weeds, if we don't stay on top of them, if you stay on top of them and you're hoeing or hand pulling, then they won't become a problem, but they could become an issue because we're not tilling I want to throw out permanent beds. So I'm not going to talk about raised beds or container gardening today, but these are another method of soil bed preparation where you could do mounded rows. So the picture in the lower right-hand corner is kind of mound up the soil, and then you maintain mulch or low-growing plant cover between the rows for walking on, so it's not muddy. It helps to reduce some compaction even in those rows. But you focus your soil preparation on those rows that you seed or transplant into. Raised beds are becoming more popular. Sometimes people just have a heavy clay soil and it's just a pain to work with. So so they'll choose to go with raised beds. And raised bed is kind of like this mounded soil. It's kind of like a raised bed, so they can be just freestanding, or they can have the enclosed sides, like the picture I show up here in the top. This was from the Backyard Farmer Garden, and that's just a very low raised bed. It gives us the option of using one of these low tunnels. Somebody asked about warming soil. This would be another way to warm soil, so you can plant earlier. Or raised beds, can be as high as 3 feet. Yeah, if you have a physical disability and you have a bad back and you don't want to bend over to plant, for example. So I just wanted to throw those out. Not going to go into them anymore because that's a topic for another day. So soil preparation steps. I will cover physical disturbance, even though we somewhat discourage it or at least limit it, but this is an option that people still use. So these would be the steps. If you're in a new garden, you want to remove that sod if it's a lawn or whatever permanent plant material is there, but typically it's a lawn area. So remove the sod with a sod cutter or a spade. It takes more work, and you want to recycle that. So maybe you can put the sod someplace else where it's needed to cover some bare soil, or you could break it up and compost it. Or, and you can just do that method, or you can kill the sod first with glyphosate or Roundup. The benefit to doing this is that Roundup is systemic, so it'll move into those turf roots and it can kill the plant. You may have less risk of the grass coming back up in your garden as a weed. So, and then you want to wait 2 to 3 weeks, not because with Roundup, it has very low soil, almost no soil residual. So initially you could actually seed into this in a few days or whatever the label says. But we usually say to wait that 2 to 3 weeks because you want time for that glyphosate to move into those roots and actually kill those plants. And it would be great. You can strip it off, but it would be great just to till it under. And that increases organic matter in your soil. Again, I'm talking about the physical disturbance here if you go that route. No-till, you would just leave it. And I'll talk about that when I talk about no-till. So after you've done this and you want to spread about a 2 to 4 inch layer of compost over the bed to increase that organic matter content. Okay, if you're using compost would be fully decomposed organic matter. It almost looks like soil already. You could probably go just a 2 inch layer or even up to 4 inches actually. That'd be great. I'm going to talk about soil testing later, so some of that might depend on soil testing. If you're using manure or undecomposed organic matter, ideally the soil preparation would be done in the fall. We recommend incorporating well-rotted manure in the fall because they can have bacteria like E. coli that can be harmful, and it's a food safety issue. So manure, we usually say incorporate in the fall, not in the spring right before planting. Or undecomposed organic matter, this would be like tree leaves in the fall that you want to work into the soil. And again, we recommend that in the fall so there's more time for those to kind of decompose and start to break down before the following spring when you're planting in there. Just if you don't have to deal with that undecomposed organic matter that might affect seed germination or something. But also as it decomposes, microorganisms that decompose it use nitrogen. So they may take it away from the plant. We can deal with that by tending to our fertilization with nitrogen. But this is the reason we often say it's best to incorporate it in the fall if it's undecomposed organic matter, like tree leaves. So after you've spread that on there, again, I'm discussing a tillage preparation method. So you could use a rototiller. We know those are a little more harmful to soil structure than just even a hand cultivator, a spade, a good old garden fork, or a broad fork. And I will talk a little bit more about broad forking. So the soil should be slightly moist, but never wet, because we don't want to create that compaction. And for vegetables, we typically want to work our soil to about at least a 6 to 8 inch depth when we're working it. I have to emphasize it, do not overtill. You know, if you choose this method, maybe once a year, the soil does not have to be fine and powdery to be a good soil bed, and it should not be fine and powdery. And we want a nice seed bed for planting in that one row. So use a rake to create that fine seed bed, rather than, for example, using a rototiller to keep chewing it up to that nice, what you might view or we might view as a nice seed bed. So broad forking, I wanted to mention this because it is a method. You can see it on the right hand there. It usually has 2 handles. It has that horizontal bar that we can step on with our foot, and they typically have these 3 to 5 tines. And this can reduce compaction, but it doesn't affect aggregation, soil aggregation, so soil structure very, very much, if at all. It aerates the soil without breaking the soil into too small of pieces, which is damaging soil structure. It's ergonomically designed to use our body weight, so it's a little bit easier on you than using a regular spade or a regular garden fork. Okay, you basically step on that bar tine to push those tines into the soil and kind of use your body weight to lean back and pull the tine through those soil. So if you're using something like that mounded garden where you have the walking paths that are mulched or have permanent plant material, you know, your row could be about as wide as this or twice as wide as this, and that would be a very effective method to use. And you would conserve your soil structure a little bit better. So soil preparation steps for a no-till method. For new gardens, you want to begin the previous season as a rule. It may take a little longer to do our soil preparation because we almost always begin the previous season if you want to focus on no-till. Again, you still want to kill that existing sod or weeds. And the methods, you can use that glyphosate or Roundup. I didn't do it for a vegetable garden, but I did it for a bed. My entire backyard, when we moved into the house, it was solid lawn, and I put in a bed all the way around, made the lawn much smaller and had beds. And we moved in June, so that fall I laid out my bed. Sprayed the turf with glyphosate, put the mulch on top of it, and then that spring, I basically just pulled back the mulch where I wanted to plant something. There was still sod underneath the mulch, and so just cut out that chunk of sod and work that soil to relieve some compaction in that area. I worked the soil twice as wide as my root ball, whether it was a perennial or a shrub or whatever, and then I planted and put the mulch back. That fall, I did some more planting, and by fall, the sod was completely decomposed. Where I pulled the mulch back to plant new, the sod was completely gone over that one summer. And I kept all that organic matter for my soil, and I reduced that tillage. Smothering is another method for killing sod or existing weeds, and we can do that by you can layer a thin layer of newspaper across the entire bed. And then you can top it off with 2 to 4 inches of organic matter. That's there basically to help hold the newspaper in place and to increase the depth for smothering. And this is going to take a little bit longer, obviously, than the glyphosate. So you'd want to start it a little sooner, maybe in August, and give it a good 2 to 3 months to smother that turf. So, and then the following spring, of course, you would just till it all under. Solarization is a method that can be used. And this one you'd have to start even earlier because it's basically laying clear plastic on top of the sod, like you see in the picture below. And we use clear plastic because it allows more heat through. It gets hotter underneath clear plastic than black plastic because black plastic absorbs. Black plastic will still warm up the soil. It just takes a little longer than clear plastic. And you want to have it on that sod for, I don't know, if anybody's done this before, I always tell people a few months when it's warm. Okay, so you want to get it good and hot underneath there to kill the sod as well as to kill any nasty perennial weeds. There are some weeds it doesn't kill very well. I don't think nut sedge it does a great job on, but the majority of them it will work on. So that's the method for no-till. That's how you would kill that existing sod or weeds. But you leave it in place. You don't remove the sod. Okay, you leave it there because we're doing no-till. And the following spring for planting, kind of like I did, you just remove the dead sod only in the rows to be planted. Okay, and you would want to do this with vegetable gardening. I remove the sod just in my planting holes. In this case, it would be in your rows, your hills, your beds, whatever you're using as a planting method. Mulch between the rows and beds for walkways. Again, because eventually that sod will all decompose. So that mulching, it doesn't get as muddy. That first summer, you may still have that sod there to walk on, but it's still a good idea to put some wood chip mulch or something down because eventually all that sod will decompose and then it will get muddy, compaction, blowing. So mulch the rows in between your rows, the walkways between your rows or beds. That first year, remember I mentioned that that first year that you plant, we need to monitor nitrogen needs every year. And we're not talking fertilization today, so I'm not going to get into it. But what happens with this no-till method with that sod, again, those microorganisms are using nitrogen to decompose that sod that's left over. And so we could encounter some nitrogen, needing additional nitrogen, particularly that first year on our vegetables. Whoops. Okay, and those are the basic steps of either doing the physical disturbance, which we are encouraging people to get away from, or if you want to just go with a no-till method. That's the basics of soil preparation. And I probably don't need to say this again, but I'm going to. So avoid, once you do your basic soil preparation going forward, avoid what harms soil structure. So if you're using a no-till, excessive tillage, so definitely limit it or try that no-till method. Compaction, don't work or walk on it wet, don't over-till it. Low organic matter, add it on a regular basis. Try to avoid bare soil, using mulch, planting. If you use the physical disturbance method and you till in the fall, consider using a cover crop or a green manure so so that soil is protected over the winter. Buildup of salts will harm it, so fertilize wisely based on a soil test, because over-fertilization can lead to salt buildup, and just be careful of the use of those manures. Know that they can increase salts in our soils. Okay, since organic matter is so darn important, maintaining that organic matter percentage. So almost all soils benefit from the addition of organic matter. I would say it's probably the one amendment that we're okay with telling people you can add it without a soil test. We recommend doing soil testing so you know where you're at, what level of organic matter do you have and other things, but it's probably the one amendment that we say it is okay to add it without doing a soil test if it's the organic matter. Remember, it breaks down over time, so it needs replenishing. Once you build your organic matter level up to that 5%, if you never added organic matter again, which most of us do anyway, but it would go down, it would drop back down. Think of it as feeding the soil ecosystem. I read this and I can't remember where I should give credit, but I like that term, that when you're adding that organic matter compost, you're feeding that soil ecosystem, those billions of organisms that are in that soil that are so critical to the roots, to the soil aggregation, and I'm sure many, many other things as well. Methods, you can work like most of us do. If you use the physical disturbance method, you can work your plants and mulch under in the fall, rough till it, or you can incorporate compost into tilled gardens. You can use cover crops and manures to increase organic matter, because these are, again, with physical disturbance, these are usually tilled in eventually. They don't have to be if you use a no-till method. And for no-till, you can spread maybe a 1 to 2 inch layer over the top of the garden each year. And again, and it'll eventually work its way in. But remember, you're probably going to be doing some kind of method with a spade or a broad fork or whatnot in those rows where you're planting. Not that you absolutely have to. You can still plant into a no-till area, completely no-till. So I thought we'd just take a quick break, not too long. What time is it? Yeah. Do we want to just wrap up, or do we want everybody want to just stand up and stretch and just? I'm going to take a drink of water and resume here in maybe another minute or two or less. I love just putting colorful pictures in my presentations, just because they're enjoyable and they make us all anxious to get out and garden. So
I we can take a quick break, and we had one comment that came in the chat to the panelists that I thought, you know, could be something potential. If someone is just putting in a new bed or a new garden and they don't want to kill the turf, they could try to extract it and plant it somewhere else if they're really good at that. That's difficult to do, but that is something you can think about.
Yeah, and I had listed that. I had said, if you know, one method is just removing it with a sod cutter, or even by spade, which takes a little bit more work, and then recycle it, plant it someplace else where it's needed. And if that's not feasible, you know, compost it. Take it to yard waste recycling where it'll be composted, or add it to your own compost. Okay, I know that's a very brief break, but I also know it's Saturday and we probably want to wrap up. It'll be a little shorter. I had about 4 slides on soil temperature, and when I saw David cover those, I went ahead and hid those. So we are probably going to get out even a little tiny bit earlier depending on questions. So soil testing. Again, that was very brief on soil preparation, but and ask whatever questions you want. We've got a great group of panelists here that can answer those questions. But why soil test? You know, it helps you to know your soil. What do you have? What are you dealing with? What does it need? And what does it not need? And sometimes I think soil testing, it's more important to know what not to add to our soils. There's so many products on the garden center shelves and the big box store shelves that say, gypsum is one example. Add this to your clay soil and you'll have a beautiful friable soil that's easy to work. Well, that only works under very specific conditions, high sodic soils, and then you can get a lot of water to do a lot of leaching of that salt out of there. So usually, I won't say it would never be needed, but usually it probably would not be needed in a typical garden. Much better to add organic matter to improve that soil structure. So soil test can help us as much what not to add as what to add. Can help us improve our soils. If you find you only have 1% organic matter, you know, I need to increase my organic matter level. That can definitely over time will help improve our soils, plus other things. It'll increase plant health and productivity, and it can help protect the environment. Nutrient pollution of our water resources is one of the major sources of water pollution. And so if we're not over fertilizing, for example, applying a nutrient such as phosphorus that we may not need, then it can definitely help protect, especially water resources. So what to test for? I think all the educators on here have heard this question. People will call. It's a good question. You know, my garden is not producing well, so I want to take a soil test to tell me what's wrong with it. And there's somewhat of a sense that a soil test will tell them everything possible, but that's not the case. So typically for gardeners, for lawns, we recommend a basic test, and these are inexpensive, maybe $15 to $20, depending on where you're having the soil test done. And a basic test will tell you that organic matter percentage. It will tell us the pH. It tests not for every possible nutrient that plants need, but it usually tests for the nitrate nitrogen, which is the available nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, and kind of depending on the lab you're using, it may test for others. Sodium, those soluble salts, buffer index. We don't often see this in Nebraska because that's usually if you have a really, really acid soil, that they'll give you a buffer index. Cation exchange capacity, and that's those positive ions and negative ions, but it's basically that soil's ability to hold nutrients. So pH, I want to touch on pH. pH, as you know, is a measure of acidity or alkalinity, and it's important because it influences the availability of nutrients. And in this chart on the right, you can see probably mostly our macronutrients and available, what pH range they're most available at. And if you look here, this 6.5 to 7, they're probably all the most readily available. So for most plants and vegetables as well, this is our ideal pH range. There are some exceptions. Blueberries obviously need way down in that 5.5. But most plants, usually it's 6.5 to 7. Okay, as it shows there, pH also influences that soil microorganisms, their activity, their populations that are so important to that soil aggregation and soil structure, as well as other things. So most vegetables, 6.5 would be ideal. That range of 6.1 to 6.8 is good. Nebraska soils, it depends on, what's been done with that soil over the years. But as a general rule, I would say most landscape, most garden soils tend to be at 6.8 or higher. And when UNL used to do soil testing, so all those soil tests came across my desk. I don't know if I ever saw a soil test under 6.8, and it wasn't unusual to see 7.5. And if you don't know, the pH scale is logarithmic. So a pH of 6 is 10 times more acid than a pH of 7. pH of 8 is 10 times more alkaline than a pH of 7, and so on. So pH is important. And changing, people will say, well, I want to grow blueberries, I'm going to change my soil pH. It can be done. It's just not that easy. So remember that liming materials will raise the pH or make it more alkaline. And so many of our garden books, sometimes our garden magazines, are written or produced on the East Coast, where they tend to have much more acid soils than we have here in Nebraska. So it's common to read that, lime your soil, lime your soil, lime your soil. Well, if you live on the East Coast, you may need to do that. If you live in the Great Plains or Nebraska, chances are you won't have to do that. Or again, there's a few exceptions to the rule. So be careful. I would never add lime in Nebraska without doing a soil test and checking my pH. Sulfur lowers the pH. So this is, as a rule, we're more likely to need sulfur if we want to have an effect on our pH or if we need to change it at all. You don't want to add either one without a soil test, because how much to add depends on factors such as the soil texture, what the pH is, how high it is or how low it is, and what you want to work towards with that pH. And changing pH takes time. You don't add elemental sulfur this spring and your pH is automatically changed. Okay, usually you want to start about a year in advance, or at least the fall before, but 1 year would be ideal. And it needs to be incorporated into the soil to about a 6-inch depth. And once you change it, it doesn't stay there forever. So it's not static. It will probably slowly revert back because it's based on the native parent material that the soil came from. Irrigation water can be high in pH. So as a rule, you may change it. You may get it down eventually to where you want it to be, but it's not going to stay there. So you need to retest again in a couple of years and probably add additional. So just an example here for lowering soil pH. This gives you an idea that it takes pounds. So if you have a soil pH of 7.5 and you want to get it down to that ideal range of 6.5, getting it down to 6.8 would be a huge help. But on a sandy soil, you would need about 10 to 15 pounds of elemental sulfur. And on a clay soil, you'd need that 20 to 25 pounds of elemental sulfur incorporated a year ahead. And I don't know, it probably wouldn't change from 6.5 to 7.5 or 7.5 to 6.5 in just 1 year. But you're going to get a good start on it there. So fertilizing based on soil testing. If we fertilize, especially some of the nutrients like phosphorus and maybe some of our other micronutrients, as a rule, nitrogen is very mobile in the environment. So some soil tests don't even test for nitrogen because it's mobile in the environment. It either leaches out of the soil, it's lost to denitrification. Plants use it, whether they need it or not sometimes, so that's why nitrogen can burn plants. So it's more mobile in the environment, and as a rule, nitrogen needs to be added each year, whether it's through no-till and good incorporation of organic matter, or you choose to use a synthetic. But it can help avoid excessive vegetative growth at the expense of flowering fruiting, and that's usually nitrogen will lead to that. And with a lot of our vegetable crops, they are fruiting crops, tomatoes, peppers, pumpkins, etc. So we don't want that excessive vegetative growth from too much nitrogen. They can delay maturity on plants, maybe make them more susceptible to maturing during hot weather, or more open out there longer for diseases or insects. So you can have delayed maturity. Fertilizing too much can result in salt buildup in the soil, salt burn. We might not see it on the plants, but the roots themselves might have salt burn, and that can affect our production long term. Deficiency of some micronutrients. If you nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are those represented by those three numbers, and so many fertilizers have all three of them. But if we have too much phosphorus, that can lead to plants not being able to take up iron, so you can end up actually too much of one nutrient can cause the deficiency of another nutrient. So, and phosphorus is very important to vegetable production, so soil test to see where you're at. Under fertilization, you can avoid that, where yields could be lowered. And research is showing that proper fertility can actually increase, the vitamin, mineral, and antioxidant content of vegetables themselves. And of course, those environmental issues that I had talked about earlier, such as water contamination. So taking a soil test. The test, it's only reliable as the sample that we send in. Home tests are not as reliable as a soil lab, so we do recommend using a soil lab. They have the right equipment, the right chemicals that are needed, they know what they're doing, and it costs about $15 to $20. So it's well worth it. Home tests can maybe get you in the range. You might know that your soil's acid, or you might know your soil's alkali, but you may not know how alkali. So we do recommend using a soil lab. And UNL used to do soil testing. They stopped this some years ago. So when people call and ask, where can I get a soil test? I just have a sheet with these labs that I have listed up here with their websites and their phone numbers. So any one of those would be a good one to use. If I'm missing one, I don't mean to leave it out. And from you usually go to the website and obtain their soil sample information sheet to fill out. You need to fill that out and complete it. And ideally, you would sample the year before establishing a new garden. If you have an established garden and you've never soil sampled, then sample anytime. Okay. Fall is sometimes a good time because in the spring in Nebraska, we have a lot of farmers doing soil testing for agriculture and so on. So sometimes it can take a little longer to get those results. And if you soil test in the fall, it helps you to plan over the winter what you want to do with that soil in the spring. So soil sampling steps in a nutshell, since this is one of our beginning classes, you want to sample when the soil's fairly dry. Use stainless steel or chrome-plated soil probes, not brass, bronze, or galvanized tools, because these can actually contaminate that sample, particularly with copper or zinc. And all the labs will give you instructions. They'll give you detailed instructions. There's videos, there's sheets that show pictures. So whatever lab you're going to use, I would go to their website and read that information because it's very good information. But a sample for a vegetable garden, we'd want it to be about 6 to 8 inches deep. And what we mean by a representative sample is you don't just go out and walk to the middle of the garden and scoop up 2 cups and put it in the box. Okay, you want a representative sample from the whole garden. So you would go out there and whatever tool you're using and get 6 to 8 samples from 8 to different areas in the garden. And then you mix them together in a very clean bucket because we don't want it to be contaminated by something. Maybe use that plastic bucket for fertilizer. And if it doesn't get cleaned out before you mix the soil in it, it could contaminate and affect the soil test results. If you have an area in a garden where nothing seems to grow in that spot, probably take a separate sample from that one area. That would be one time where you would just take a separate sample from, just take one sample and try not to mix that into the representative or the composite sample. Remove if there's surface debris in there, if there's pieces of mulch, pieces of leaves. For example, when we do a lawn, we always say to take out the thatch material and the grass. So you don't want to have a lot of that organic matter in there. Remove that. And then you usually submit about 2 cups to the soil lab. And you can do that in a sandwich bag. Some of them will provide a box to send it in. We said you go to their website and they'll give you very detailed instructions. And then there's those soil test results, which can be head scratchers, but I think they've gotten much better over the years. But most labs, again, they'll provide information on interpreting those results, or they'll provide recommendations right within the sample itself, the result itself. And a lot of them have gone to this having a rating of very low to very high. So I think that makes it just more understandable. But remember, very, very low might be good. Very high might be good. So you want to understand that soil result. So if you don't understand it, if you can't get the information from the lab itself, feel free to take a soil test report to your local extension office, and we'll work with you in interpreting it and some of the things that you need to be doing to improve your soil. Okay, so like I said, I got done. I had about 3 slides on soil temperature, but David covered that very, very well. So that's why I'm wrapping up just a little bit early, but not a lot. I love this saying, Leonardo da Vinci: we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. And that soil provides the foundation for all our plant growth, the production of all our food crops, and more. It's so important. We should learn more about it. And I like the USDA's sheet here on unlocking the secrets in the soil. So questions?
So we have one, and Scott's typing an answer, but we can answer it live too. How about bagged mushroom compost?
Okay, I've heard good things about that. I do have Susan Nelson, who's on here. She uses it. But John, you probably know more about it than I do, the pros, the cons. So I'm going to turn that one over to you.
Well, so mushroom compost, is a lot of times what is used from the production of mushrooms. So it has like a good fungal, good fungi in there to add to the soil. But you also have to remember that what they grow some mushrooms on is like horse manure and manure. So there could be manure in there. So you just want to watch for that, because it could be like very, very strong. And the question, went on to say that they had clay soil and they heard that adding stuff like mushroom compost was good. And I would say any compost is good for soil, especially clay soil, to help with that texture issue.
Thank you. John is, of us educators, John is our vegetable specialist. So when we know who Scott is our ID expert. John knows a lot about lawns. I know a lot about trees. So that's why I decided to turn that over to John. I've just heard it's a good compost to use, but I had never heard if there were really any pros or cons to be aware of, or cons to be aware of. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing then. I wanted to leave it up for a little while to give people a chance to read some of that and appreciate soil.
Another question, someone starting a brand new raised garden. Would it be safe to assume that bagged, like Miracle-Gro soil, wouldn't need a soil test?
That's a good question. We hear Miracle-Gro. I'm an extension, so I'm not talking negative, but Miracle-Gro it has fertilizer already in it. I would still do a soil test to see where you're at. I mean, if you're getting the bag of Miracle-Gro to say grow vegetables in a container, you're going to do bucket gardening. And we do recommend for raised beds, for container gardening, for raising vegetables, we do recommend getting a good potting soil mix and not going out to the garden and using soil, because that can tend to be true soil, real soil, because that can tend to be too heavy in your containers and you get poor drainage, you don't get those oxygen. So, in Miracle-Gro, Yeah, I don't know. You wouldn't have to test the Miracle Grow if you're going to put it into your soil, into your container itself. So,
Yeah.
but know that those nutrients get in a container, nitrogen particularly over time are going to get leached out, and the micronutrients are going to eventually get lost or used up. And that's why we usually say to change out that soil. Some people say to change it annually, put fresh soil in. I kind of cheat. I kind of dump out my containers into the wheelbarrow, and then I add half a bag of the potting soil that I like. And I mix it all together, and then I put it back in the containers. So
yeah,
that's kind of how I deal with that.
And so, yeah, I think, if you're using like Miracle Grow and some of those companies coming out with like a garden soil that you could use, like it's basically soil mixed with some compost, etc. You could do that probably cheaper just by buying compost and some topsoil and mixing it together. I wouldn't use, if you're doing a raised bed, I don't know that I would use potting soil, because that's mostly just like peat or core, and there's not a lot of actual soil in there. Another question, someone's wanting to mix their own soil for a new garden. What are the percentages of like topsoil and organic matter? And I know, so I've seen a formula, and I don't know, I'll share it, and then you can sort of follow up if you have something different. But I've seen, it depends on if you're measuring it by volume, like if you're buying bagged stuff and it says like cubic feet or quarts or whatever, versus weight. Because as Kelly said, we're wanting to aim for around 5%. You can go a little bit higher than that, but around 5% of organic matter. And so if you're doing by weight, like you're getting a load of compost and a load of soil, and they're weighing it, you want it like 5% organic matter, 95% soil in that mix that you're getting. If you're going for something like by volume, like bagged stuff, it's about 50%, because that organic matter is much lighter than the soil. And so you want to mix it about 50-50. So if you're getting like a 1 cubic foot of soil for your raised bed, then you want 1 cubic foot of organic matter, because it's much lighter and fluffier. Kelly, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, just that I agree. I mean, I've heard a very simple thing is to do a third topsoil, a third peat moss, something such as that, or compost, a third compost. I've heard using a third sand, but you have to really incorporate. You have to mix it in a wheelbarrow or something ahead of time. And I should have touched on the idea that people think if they have a heavy clay soil, well, I'm going to add sand to improve it. Never do that. I overlooked talking about that. Add compost, add organic matter. If you add sand to clay, you can end up with cement, because that's how they make cement.
I was going to say, that's what they do every day at the cement mixing plant.
That's right. So logically, it seems to make sense, but you just cannot get enough sand thoroughly mixed in. So you end up with cement. So no sand for clay, no gypsum for clay, except in certain situations, organic matter, compost.
Yeah, actually, Kelly, you would have to approach 85-90% by volume sand, which is really what happens in the golf and sports turf industries. If you go to the College World Series and watch the players, or any professional or semi-professional sports field, they're playing mostly on sand, and they're only having about maybe 5 to 10% peat moss. There's no real soil in those kind of settings. And so, yeah, you have to have mostly, if not all, sand. Otherwise, they have brick. I've used the example of bricks, but I think concrete is better. I like your term there, concrete. Yeah.
It just squeezes out what little pore space there is, and it's gone. We talked about an example. We also said parking lot. You end up with a parking lot.
Parking lot is good. Yeah.
There's no way for those roots to move anywhere. They're done.
Kelly, I also want to underscore what you said about bagged products. Many of these, the Miracle Grow, are good products, but sometimes they have ingredients in there you're not aware of. You mentioned that they almost always have a fertilizer in there, which is a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing because it doesn't allow you to make changes, because it'll be there in slow release over most of the growing season. And it's, you know, as gardeners, it's almost like being cooks. We want to add things to it. You know, we want to spice it up a little bit. I think that started with Emerald. You know, he was one of the first celebrity chefs. If you have a slow release fertilizer in there and you've been using one of these long-term products, adding is probably not a good idea, because you're going to put in too much fertilizer, and that will slow down the production of the edible parts of the plants. And that's why we're growing vegetable gardens, right? Is we want tomatoes and peppers and all kinds of things like that. I'm glad you brought that up, is what's in the bag. What are the different components? And you have to read the fine print.